Before the room fills with daylight, the threshold already knows the shape of the day. It holds the cold in its stone and wood. It keeps the last trace of night in the seam under the door, where a thin line of darker air waits against the floorboards. A hand that reaches for the latch meets a surface worn smooth by years of ordinary passing. Nothing here is ceremonial. Nothing has been preserved for a museum. And yet the doorway remains, patient and exact, carrying the memory of every quiet step that crossed it. Inside the room, the first objects appear slowly, as they do when darkness is still leaving. A bench, a bowl, a folded cloth, a lamp trimmed low, a shelf with jars and packets that never seem to move much, though they are used often enough to keep their edges from going soft. The room is not grand. It is not meant to impress. It is meant to hold a life in order. This is how memory often begins in older places. Not with a speech, and not with a monument, but with a threshold. A doorway marks the line between what has been lived and what is about to be repeated. A room remembers the bodies that warmed it. A table remembers the weight of hands. Even the air remembers, in its own quiet way, where smoke once rose, where rain was left on cloaks, where a voice paused before speaking. In the earliest light, the room is almost nothing more than outline and promise. Yet that is enough. A threshold can be a kind of archive. Passage can store a habit. A door can keep the memory of a household, a craft, a season, and 1,000 small returns. So the day begins where many days begin in the historical world, in a narrow space between outside and in, between cold and warmth, between what is still held in shadow and what will soon be used again. The hour before full morning is quiet in a way that makes every small sound feel deliberate. Cloth shifts softly over the bench. A cup touches wood with a rounded familiar note. Somewhere beyond the wall, a bird begins and then stops, as if testing the air before committing to it. The room at the threshold is a practical room. It might serve a household, a workshop, or a learned house where writing and keeping are part of the day's labor. The exact name matters less than the logic of the place. There is always a center. There is always a surface for work. There is always a place where things are set down, so the hands can return to them in the right order. By the door, the threshold itself is darkened by use. It is polished where heels have turned, scuffed where boots and sandals have rested, and dusty where the edge of the room does not fully see the broom. The floor has been swept, but not made perfect. Older interiors rarely were. Their beauty lived in use, in the trace of purpose. The room's memory is not stored in one grand object. It is spread across many smaller ones. A shallow bowl remembers washing water. A folded cloth remembers hands. A shelf remembers packets and jars. A knife remembers rope, wax, thread, and the careful opening of bundles. A lamp remembers the hours when light had to be carried by oil, wick, and attention, rather than by switches or speed. Outside, the morning grows a little less blue. Inside, the warm zone around the lamp remains small, and because it is small, it feels intimate. This is one of the quiet truths of older rooms. Light is not evenly distributed. It gathers. It clings to edges. It settles where work must be done. It leaves the corners to their own patience. And so the threshold becomes more than an entrance. It becomes a measured place. One side holds weather, shadow, and arrival. The other holds routine, touch, and the things that must be kept ready. Between those two sides, memory gathers without effort. The steady rhythm of the room begins with repetition, but not the empty kind. It begins with the reliable return of tasks that have already learned how to fit the body. One hand reaches for the lamp. Another straightens the cloth. A third small motion draws a chair a little closer to the table. These are not dramatic actions. They are the quiet mechanics of readiness. The world of the room does not ask to be admired. It asks to be used with care. There is comfort in that order. The same door, the same table, the same shelf, the same corner where the draught enters in winter and then fades as the fire warms the stone. The same path between the threshold and the work surface. The same pause before the first task begins. Over time, such repetitions become a kind of spoken language. The room says what it expects. The hands answer. In many historical spaces, this is how calm is built. Not by removing all motion, but by making motion legible. A poured cup, folded sheet, a bent reed, a knot tied and checked once more. Each act appears small on its own. Together, they create a structure strong enough to hold thought without strain. The threshold still matters here, even as the room settles into work. It reminds the room that there is always an outside. Wind can enter. Rain can bring mud. A messenger may arrive with wet cloak and colder news. But the threshold also reminds the outside that the room has rules of its own. Shoes are wiped. Cloaks are hung. Voices are lowered. A place of labor becomes a place of measured attention. This is the rhythm that steadies sleep-safe narration. Not excitement, but continuity. Not novelty for its own sake, but enough variation to keep the mind gently awake to texture. The grain of wood, the pull of wool, the faint yellow at the edge of lamp flame. The soft economy of a room that never spends more motion than necessary. And in that economy, memory grows calmer. It stops fluttering and starts resting where it belongs. To understand a threshold in an older world, it helps to remember how much of daily life depended on boundaries that were both physical and social. A doorway did not merely separate weather from shelter. It sorted noise from quiet, public from private, arrival from permission. In a townhouse, a workshop, a noble chamber, or a clerical room, the threshold carried its own discipline. One did not rush across it without noticing the room beyond. One did not fling doors wide unless there was a reason. In many households and working spaces, the threshold was among the most frequently touched parts of the building and among the least remarked upon. That combination made it powerful. The overlooked things often hold the longest memory. Historical rooms were rarely uniform. The floor might be stone near the door and wood farther in. The window might be narrow or high or set to catch only a little the best light. The walls might hold hooks, boards, shelves, or hanging cloths intended to keep the room from feeling too exposed. The room adapted to season, labor, and temperature. It was never only a container. It was a tool, and tools remember use. A working room tells its story through wear. The corner where baskets have scraped. The bench where someone always sits to unlace boots. The patch of floor darkened by water from washing or by the constant turning of feet. The edge of a table softened by years of sleeves passing across it. These are not decorative details. They are historical evidence in a form that need not be translated. In such spaces, memory is not abstract. It is embedded. A person entering the room can tell, almost at once, how the space is meant to behave. A room for rest speaks one language. A room for storage speaks another. A room for copying, counting, sorting, or keeping speaks a language of alignment and stillness. The threshold is where those languages meet. This is why thresholds matter so much in documentary history. They are small, but they reveal the larger order. A threshold shows which rooms are intimate, which rooms are useful, which rooms are shared, and which rooms are guarded. It shows how people move through their day and how a building teaches the body what kind of work belongs where. In some houses, the threshold was reinforced with stone. In others, it was no more than a well-trodden board. But in every case, it taught the same lesson: entry is never neutral. Crossing is a kind of agreement. The room receives the body, and the body agrees to the room's rules. That simple exchange carried the shape of countless historical mornings. People would rise before the sun. They would cross a threshold. They would begin work in a room that had already been used by others. And by the time the day was fully open, the room would already be carrying several layers of memory. The last light, the previous evening's order, the first touch of a hand, the first careful pause before labor resumed. This was not unusual. It was the fabric of ordinary life. Ordinary life, when observed closely, is where history becomes most believable. The record of a grand event may be rare, but the record of a threshold is always near at hand. One need only look at the scuff on the wood, the worn edge of the stone, the folded cloth tucked against the wall, and the story begins to appear. The work of the room begins with preparation, and preparation is where memory becomes practical. The shelf is checked first, not because it is exciting, but because it is trusted. A jar may hold oil. A packet may hold thread. A small box may hold seals, chalk, twine, or folded slips of paper. A larger container may keep away dust and damp. In a historical room, storage is never passive. It is a daily act of preservation. What is saved through repetition, not ceremony. Then comes the table, where the world narrows into a surface of use. On the table, a knife lies beside cord. A cloth is unfolded, and then folded again, not because the folds themselves matter, but because the hands prefer order they can understand. A bowl of water catches the first real light and returns it softly. The bowl makes no claim to importance, yet the room would feel wrong without it. The threshold stays present in the background. Sometimes the door is ajar, and the day's colder air brushes in. Sometimes it is shut, and the room feels like a small vessel holding warmth. Either way, the threshold reminds everything in the room that there is a limit. The limit makes the room readable. Without it, the room would be only a blur of things. That is one reason older interiors can feel so calm. Their purpose creates clarity. A room for mending has one kind of object logic. A room for keeping records has another. A room for reading or copying has a third. Yet all of them rely on the same basic rhythm: take, place, use, return. This rhythm is what allows an episode like this to breathe without wandering. The narration can move from shelf to table, from table to threshold, from threshold to the corner where cloth softens the draft, and each movement can still belong to the same world. The room does not need to be crowded to feel full. A few objects, repeated with purpose, carry more weight than many objects that never mean anything. As the morning settles in, the work deepens. A surface is cleared. A page is smoothed. A tool is set where the hand expects it. The motion is careful because care saves time later. When an ordinary historical routine is done well, it leaves almost no visible triumph. It leaves readiness. Readiness is a quiet kind of achievement. It is the drawer that opens, without sticking. The shelf that gives back what was placed there. The stool that is already waiting, and the lamp trimmed before the flame weakens. The room learns these patterns so fully that the body can move without thinking too much about each step. And yet, even here, memory keeps surfacing. A notch in a board reminds the hand where to pause. A stain near the edge of the table suggests previous tasks and previous seasons. A crack in the plaster may have been ignored for years, but the eye knows it, and the room knows it, and that knowledge quietly shapes the way the work is done. Historical life often survives in such small repetitions, not in one perfect image, but in the dependable sequence of use. The threshold, shelf, table, cloth, tool, and return to them all matter. It is enough to build a day. It is enough to build a memory. As the day begins without hurry, the memory can remain gentle. The room grows deeper, not by becoming busier, but by becoming more familiar. At this stage, the same objects carry slightly different meanings. The cloth is no longer only a cloth. It is a sign that dust must be kept away from the work. The shelf is no longer only storage. It is a map of what the room considers necessary. The threshold is no longer only an entrance. It is the line where the outside gives up its noise, and the inside gathers itself for another stretch of useful time. Outside, the weather may have changed. A gray sky may press lightly against the walls. A thin wind may slide through the street, touch the eaves and move on. But inside the room, weather becomes a second-hand thing, felt only in the way the floor stays cool beneath the feet, or the way the lamp has to be trimmed more carefully when the air is damp. This is one of the oldest forms of historical intimacy, not dramatic closeness, but practical adaptation. People lived with weather by building rooms that answered back. They tightened shutters. They lifted hems. They moved chairs. They changed where they sat. They placed work where the best light reached. In those adjustments, a whole life of care is visible. The threshold plays its part in this adjustment. It is where wet cloaks are shaken. It is where a messenger pauses before entering. It is where a child might be told to wait until the floor is dry. It is where a household learns over time how to separate movement from interruption. The threshold teaches patience by being the place where patience is required. Meanwhile, the room's routine continues. A small object is checked and set aside. A container is sealed again. A tool is wiped. A piece of string is cut to length, then maybe cut once more because the first cut was too generous. The body learns restraint through these tiny corrections, and the corrections themselves become part of the memory of the place. The historical world is full of such modest precision. Grain is measured by feel as well as by sight. Water is judged by sound when poured. Cloth is folded in ways that make sense to hands that have done it 1,000 times. A room like this is never only a backdrop for work. It is a partner in the work, shaping pace, light, and attention. If the room is written well in narration, the listener does not need a large amount of novelty to remain present. What matters is the accumulation of meaning. The same lamp means one thing at first light, another thing at midday, and a third thing as evening arrives. The same bench means rest, waiting, or sorting depending on who sits there and why. The same threshold means arrival in one moment and departure in the next. That shifting function is where duration lives. Not in filler, not in repetition for its own sake, but in the way familiar objects keep changing role as the day changes around them. So the room continues to teach the listener how to see it. It teaches by repetition with variation. By returning to the shelf, but not quite the same shelf. By returning to the threshold, but not quite the same threshold. By returning to the table, but now with a new use, or a new hand, or a new shadow across it. This is why the episode can remain calm while still feeling full. It does not need a dramatic event. It needs a faithful progression through use. The room, after all, is a memory device, made of wood, stone, cloth, and light. Each time the hand crosses its threshold, it records one more ordinary truth. And ordinary truths, carefully observed, can carry a great deal of time. Later in the day, when the room has settled into its own familiar temperature, small details become more noticeable. The lamp's edge turns a little darker where soot has gathered. The cloth over the bench has a crease that has not been smoothed out. The wood grain on the table runs under the fingertips like a path worn into memory. A jar lid does not sit quite flush, though it is close enough to keep what it holds safe from dust. A doorway hinge gives the smallest complaint when the door shifts. None of these details are dramatic. All of them are true to how a lived-in room actually feels. This final stretch is not the time for new concepts. It is the time for return. The threshold returns. The shelf returns. The bench returns. The bowl returns. The room returns to its own logic and asks only that it be understood a little more carefully than before. In a sleep-safe documentary rhythm, this kind of detail expansion works because it slows attention without draining it. The mind can follow a crease in cloth, a dark line in stone, a thin band of light under the door. It can rest inside the material facts of a room that does not need to announce itself. The room remains modest. That modesty is part of its strength. The historical world often reveals itself most clearly when nothing is forcing it into spectacle. A doorway is a doorway. A bench is a bench. A shelf is a shelf. Yet each one has survived because it answered a need. The threshold kept heat. The bench allowed rest or sorting. The shelf kept order. The room, together with its objects, made ordinary life more possible. Memory, in such a place, is not nostalgic. It is practical. It says, this is where the cloak was hung. This is where the page was smoothed. This is where the bowl was set. This is where the door was held a second longer in winter, so the room would keep its warmth. These are not grand events. They are the grammar of dwelling. The room also teaches restraint. A well-used room does not demand constant change. It rewards continuity. The same tools in the same places. The same path from threshold to table. The same habit of checking the shelf before beginning. These patterns can feel almost invisible until they are broken, and then their importance becomes plain at once. That is why the final detail expansion can remain quiet and still feel meaningful. It is not padding the episode with extra words. It is recognizing that a room's smallest features are often the ones that hold the most memory. A worn step, a softened edge, a hook polished by years of repeated hanging, a darkened knot in a beam. Each one says that time has been here and has not left without leaving evidence. The threshold, once more, becomes the center of that evidence. It has taken the weather in and out. It has carried feet, water, dust, and pauses. It has taught the room how to be a room. And by the end of the day, it seems less like an edge and more like a witness. As the room moves toward evening, the light thins and the threshold grows less distinct. The same door that held the day in place now holds back the night. The same table that received work now receives only the last clean cup, the last folded cloth, the last check that everything is where it should be. There is a deep calm in a room that has finished its tasks well. Nothing is forced. Nothing is announced. The body knows how to leave it in order. The eye knows where the lamp stands. The hand knows where the threshold lies. The room does not need to say much more. What remains is the feeling of continuity, not the repetition of identical moments, but the recognition that the day has been part of a larger pattern. A room is entered. Work is done. Objects are returned. The threshold receives the last crossing and keeps it. Night approaches, and the room, which began as outline and promise, becomes again a darkened shape with memory in its grain. This is the quiet gift of ordinary historical spaces. They remember without speaking loudly. They carry the shape of labor without turning it into spectacle. They turn the simplest things into anchors: a shelf, a bench, a bowl, a door, a stone edge, a strip of warmth beneath a lamp. These things do not ask to be extraordinary. They ask to be used well. And so the episode ends where it began, at the threshold, where one side holds the last warmth of the room and the other side waits in weather and dusk. The line between them is small, but it contains a whole habit of life. Step by step, day by day, the threshold keeps that habit safe. Memory is often thought of as something large and inward, but here it appears as something practical and near at hand. It lives in the places touched most often. It lives in the room that knows its work. It lives in the calm confidence of objects that return to their places when the day is done. As the light settles and the room grows still, there is nothing to rush. The threshold remains. The shelf remains. The table remains. The quiet remains. And in that quiet, the memory of the day rests where it can be found again tomorrow.